Hello everyone, my name is Samuel Oswald. I am a data scientist at VITO, and today I'm going to be talking to you about semi-automated object detection workflows using UAV imagery. And so I'll get straight into it. Today I'll start with an introduction to us at VITO and kind of what we do, talk about object detection and its applicability within the plant phenotyping domain, what the current challenges are in kind of implementing object detection and how we try to address them with the MAPEO workflow, go through some of the results we've had, and then talk a little bit about additional use cases and what the future can be for object detection in plant phenotyping. So I'll get straight into it. We're VITO, this is who I work for. We're a leading European research company. We are principally based in Belgium, but have offices throughout the world. So we have almost 1,000 employees, are quite involved in a lot of different research domains, so not just in plant phenotyping or in remote sensing. And we're focused on bridging the gap between industry and academia, and also focused on building towards a sustainable future. And so we provide a lot of partnerships where we principally act as the software tools or infrastructure professionals to universities, companies, and other researchers. And we're always looking for interesting new collaborations and projects. And I work within the remote sensing team, and so we're quite a large team. We look at UAV, airborne, and satellite imagery and use these to capture processes in various domains. Here you can see that we work on a global or regional level with satellite data. We also work in precision agriculture as well as plant phenotyping using aerial and principally UAV imagery. And we have experience working with machine learning models, and we have several applications that we work on these for. For example, one is the World Cereal application, where VITO works in collaboration with the ESA and others to map annual global coverage of grains such as wheat and maize. We also have other projects such as the CropSAR one, which I show on the right here, and this looks at improving in situ crop monitoring and trying to fill the gaps with existing data. So you often have a lot of cloud cover, which can make it difficult to assess your plant health at different dates. And these kind of models, which are implemented within platforms such as Watch It Grow, can be useful for making a more robust plant health prediction. And so moving on now to talk more about the phenotyping case. As many of you are no doubt aware, phenotyping can be done in a range of environments. So you can do it in the laboratory where you generally are able to have a more controlled environment, or you can move on to the greenhouse where you can strike a midpoint between kind of the control over the experiment and the agricultural relevance, or you can perform it in the field where typically you are able to, of course, get a lot more agricultural relevance, but you make it a lot more difficult to actually follow traits within the field and follow traits over what are often quite large areas, especially when you're doing it in traditional methods. So on this side, you can see kind of a summary of how it's traditionally been done in field-based phenotyping, whereby you have a worker or a series of researchers in the field doing handheld measurements, which can be effective, but is generally very time consuming. It's difficult to scale, and also it's at risk of subjectivity of the measurements. To compare this with drone-based phenotyping, here it's possible to do quick and objective scanning, and you can cover much larger regions and at a much better ability to scale up than in traditional methods. But there are questions around it. With UAV-based phenotyping, you can't, as you would in the field, just go and like measure this is the plant height because I have my level that shows me this. You have to find ways to work that out using the imagery or some kind of indice that acts as a proxy for it. So what we find is that when using UAVs, there are quite a lot of different proxies and things you can do. So height would be something that can be done quite well now using UAV methods, since here you can get height indices just derived from structured from motion methods. So whereby you calculate the difference between points among images and then create elevation models from that, which can let you know, especially when you're doing it over multiple dates, what the ground level is and what the ultimate height of plants would be. For other things, you can look at threshold models. So in simple RGB imagery, you might look at where an image is most green and where it is not so green, which might tell you this is the place where we find plant cover and this is the place where we find soil cover. And of course, you have multispectral indices like NDVI and others which can act as proxies for general plant health. But of course, the indices are often a proxy to the trait rather than the trait itself. And some traits can be difficult to find even with these methods. And so this is where things like object detection can come in handy. So one good example where object detection is very applicable is using plant emergence. So typically to count plant emergence, you would do as you might do in the bottom picture on this slide, where you have a cover map over the field, and then you would look at where you get kind of these clumps of green, which would indicate that this is a single individual object, and then separate these out. But then, of course, there's other questions, like in this example, you can see the presence of weeds, and so this makes it appear as though you have one single long line of plants and also plants which are actually between the rows. And you might also have, as you can see elsewhere in the image, just kind of very small, like single or just a few pixel examples. And here might not be a full plant, or it might be just a very small plant, and you need to figure out how you're going to account for that. Likewise for overlapping plants. In this case, this is for maize. You see already there's quite some overlap between the crops, and it is difficult to actually separate these in some cases, since if you do use a kind of grouping rule, they may be grouped together and you have an underestimation of the final count. To compare that with an object detection method, here you would manually annotate a training set and train a neural network in order to look for the different objects. And this is a lot more versatile. So not only does it look for where there's an object and the classification of this object, it also acknowledges where there is not an object. So things like the weeds are not going to be included in the final output because in the training data set, they should not be labeled. And so if you have a well-labeled data set, it should be possible to both find the objects and also not be prone to the errors that might occur with a simpler thresholding based model. So in this case, and also with the right architecture, you can see that in the central bit where you find a lot of weeds, there's actually very well classified crops and their emergence, and elsewhere the overlap is handled well, and there's no issues with smaller plants or any of these other kind of pixel issues that you might find. Moving on from that, there are more complex cases. For example, plant organ detection. In this case, compared to plant emergence, it's not so easy to make a generalized model or process. In the case of plant emergence, you're, no matter the crop, generally just looking for where are individual plants popping up from the ground, generally against a background of bare soil. Whereas for plant organs, you are looking for specific features in what are often very noisy images. And so thresholding methods in a lot of cases won't work here. And can be harder than Emergence, as I mentioned, due to the noise. So in this example, you see at the top onion heads, which is probably one of the easier cases. Here it's they're very well kind of defined kind of circular bulbs on top of the plants, which are still quite difficult to detect with a thresholding method, but with object detection obviously perform well. In the middle, this is pumpkin detection. It's hard with the overlay to see the color of the pumpkins, which is orange, but here is also not so difficult, although you can see that the images can be quite noisy. And another issue is with pumpkins, whilst they're typically thought of as orange, there's actually a multitude of colors that they can come in. And when you get, say, a greener pumpkin or a whiter pumpkin, then it might be difficult to actually create a model that distinguishes it by color. At the bottom, you see wheat head detection, which I will talk about in the coming slides. And here is often very complex because you have small objects facing in a lot of different directions, and in the background you generally have a lot of leaves and other plant material, which can be difficult to distinguish if you don't have sufficient resolution or if there's a problem with the camera settings. And so, as I mentioned, wheat head detection is a specific application of plant organ detection. It's a key indicator for wheat yield, wheat air density that is, and so is very useful to be able to find using an object detection or a UAV-based workflow. And so traditionally the way to do this in the field is by counting them in some way, but there's no standard method and it's limited in scope. So there can be counts while they're in field, but that can be quite hard as they're generally just like kind of all over the place. They can be harvested and then counted post-harvest. But there's kind of drawbacks to all of these methods, and of course it can be destructive as well and difficult, as I mentioned, to scale. Whereas if automated, this actually allows for much higher coverage, so for an entire field. It's non-invasive, and yeah, with pixel methods, it is really in this case very difficult to do. So object detection, here, rather than traditionally counting out in the field, you are able to annotate. So this is much faster than actually counting in the field. Like if you have an image, it's possible to annotate them quite quickly if you have well-defined wheat heads on that image. Obviously, coverage is much higher, and you end up with something that can distinguish the background noise from the target objects, which you might not get if you did try to do some kind of thresholding or model which tries to look for the wheat heads but without an advanced architecture behind it. But there are issues. You need to ensure that there's consistent data collection, which I'll go through a bit more in the following slides. When you have images that are too different, you can find that the model will struggle. So this is something that has been found in datasets such as the Global Wheathead Challenge, which is a large-scale dataset from over the world of wheatheads, which aims to kind of create these kind of models and actually make object detection and machine learning more of a part of the phenotyping process. And so the architectures themselves have really developed and advanced a lot in the last few years. So you have kind of a variety of different main parent architectures, let's say, which can include RCNN and its derivatives, YOLO networks, as well as now transformer networks, which are becoming used in imagery. And these are developing quite rapidly, and so to kind of always have state-of-the-art results, you need to have a process which can follow these new architectures, because if you do things ad hoc, then you might use one architecture, but then later you might want to do a similar task on a newer architecture, but this would require a lot of labor then to implement. And so you need to search for architectures which are also fine-tuned towards the phenotyping use case, which, as you've seen, is mainly small, dense imagery compared to other data sets which might have larger imagery. There is a constant improvement of architectures, as I mentioned, and so you need a system which is versatile to new developments, and also one that, even with these new developments, you can maintain, say, advantages in how you augment the data or pre-process the data, which can carry over and still be useful. So yeah, the requirements for this object detection are that you need to have consistent data preparation, manually labeled inputs, as well as a good architecture and process to complete it in a way that's not going to be too time consuming. Each time you do it is repeatable and can be generalizable to new data. And so one of the first things, of course, is consistent data preparation. And this can relate also to making sure that you collect good images. Principally, that is one of the most important things, of course, in an object detection use case. And so something that we've done in the past to kind of test the applicability of machine learning models is a comparison of both different drones in terms of their camera and their image quality, as well as the different ground resolutions and the impact of that. You can see here that even when looking from some quite professional grade cameras such as the Zenmuse X5S to the Phantom Pro 4 Pro and then the cheaper Mavic 2 Pro, that there's quite a difference in image quality even when collected at the same resolution. And so this is one thing to be aware of. Even in this second picture, the similar or the less contrasting colors of the image will generally result in a worse performing model than in the first one, where you generally have very nice contrast. And moving further on, resolution is very important to many machine learning models, since a lot of what they look for to differentiate objects, especially in these kind of quite complex cases, internal features, which you can see are quite prominent in the first picture but are lost in the lower resolution. So the first is at 1mm resolution. Even at 2mm resolution and 5mm resolution, it becomes more difficult to distinguish these, and they become smaller in terms of pixel size and have less internal geometry. But as a trade-off, of course, you can see on the right, there can be issues with stitching using structure from motion methods. So you either have to be very certain of your imagery and that there is enough features to be able to match them between the different points. Or alternatively, you can fly with a camera that covers a higher area. And this is one of the ways in which object detection using drones is now becoming more accessible. So there's become a big advance in the availability of high-resolution cameras, and these can address common data issues, including that the flight is high enough to not affect fields, that it covers a large spatial extent, which can make it easier to align images. There's faster completion of flights, and there's often very sharp imagery. And so to address the larger spatial extent, you can see in the left, with a kind of standard camera at 24 megapixels, you would expect coverage to be almost kind of a quarter of what you would find in a 100 megapixel camera. And in this corner, you might still find features to match, but as the camera moves over the center of a plot, you will end up just only having the crop in an image, and then that can make it very difficult to find features to match to other images, and that's how you get the gaps which you saw on the previous slide. And of course, another thing is just faster completion of flights. As you do fly through the day, you are exposed to changing lighting and weather conditions, and these can both affect your overall data set and make it more difficult to complete object detection if you do have lots of images taken under different lighting conditions. As a result of that, you would need to do a lot more manual work for annotating enough images to cover your target area. And so here's an example we did using the phase 1 100 megapixel camera at 21 meters flight height. You are able to, as you can see there, get high coverage. So it doesn't just cover the plot, it covers also the ground between, which is often where features can be matched from. And in addition, it still maintains the high resolution as though you were flying closer to the ground with another camera and still maintaining the quality. And so this is something that now we are working on and of course are open to partnerships with. So these very high resolution cameras will allow for the building of even more robust and more high quality and applicable models in the future. And so in the past, these kind of models have been applied in the phenotyping context, but they're often only applied on individual sites, and it can be hard to generalize for multiple reasons. Principally, this can be due to visual differences in varieties. So if you do want to cover every species of wheat or maize or whatever, you will probably want to have examples from all of these species, or at least from visually similar ones. And additionally, error can be introduced by inconsistent image collection and processing. So even among the same research group or the same company, it might be that there's no standardized approach to collecting images. So you might have one which is collected at 1 millimeter in the middle of the day, and you might have one that is collected earlier with different lighting conditions and 2 millimeters resolution. And this will make it harder to relate the data sets. In addition, like they may just simply be inconsistently prepared. So you might create one data set where you use all of the image and you tile it to 512 pixels, whereas another might tile it to 256 pixels and only use images from the center. And so to be able to use your data and kind of leverage it to generalize, you do need to have some method of standardizing a workflow and standardizing the kind of data collection process and the processing process. And this is principally what we at VITO work on, creating workflows and tools which make this easier so that we can facilitate other research and other projects. And in this case, we principally do it through MAPEO, which is an end-to-end drone processing workflow. And it works from end to end. So the principal objective is to standardize UAV phenotyping workflows, prevent costs related to additional labor in advanced applications. So of course, in the object detection, it also should be something that is produced very easily rather than being something which a researcher needs to invest a lot of time and labor in, especially if it isn't their specific domain, this one of machine learning. And so this is just an overview of the MAPEO infrastructure. As you can see, there's a data acquisition domain. It is then processed on a cloud backend and then pushed through to a web platform where users can access it or incorporate it into their own workflows. And a lot of products can be produced from this. We work a lot also on kind of testing the applicability of drone workflows and UAV flights to new products, as well as what kind of data you might need to actually retrieve the product that you're looking for. And so here you can see, some of these kind of examples of what we found are the ideal camera types, the ideal resolutions for different applications. So this can be for things like crop height, of course, as well as cover, health, and more advanced AI algorithms, which look at crop count or organ count and other things as well. And then, we have visualization tools. So once uploaded, it is possible to kind of do quick checks of the data by visualizing on the web platform for lots of different products, seeing how it changes over time, and getting this kind of very kind of quick overview of what is happening in the research fields and how that changes over time, over the course of a trial. And yeah, naturally, there's many other features involved in this. The delineation, so that you would want to probably export your data in plots. So you want to get your plot statistics, and we provide the tools to create these plots or to upload your own plots if you've already defined the field data. And from here, export statistics both for raster data such as NDVI or plant height products, but also for the vector products which are produced through object detection methods. And then naturally following on from that, it's possible to extract the data using the web platform itself, or it's also stored and accessible for API or notebook use, which can make it then easier to automatically ingest into existing workflows or into existing research. And so going more into detail about our object detection workflow and how we kind of address the need for standardization for consistent data and for an architecture or a process that keeps the implementations up to date so that you can be assured that the model you're using is the current most suited model for the task. And so, yeah, it involves being able to, one, aggregate the data. So rather than having ad hoc flights, which then you can train a model on, but you can't use that data for your next flight, which you collect in a different way. We want to make it so that you can use that data and eventually even have models which are possible to be aggregated and the model is used only for inference rather than also for the training steps. Optimized towards phenotyping applications, as I mentioned, it's typically small and dense objects, so we do research into what architectures are currently most applicable to it and implementing these architectures, as well as what data processing or augmentation we can do to optimize the end results. Other things include smart training data selection, as well as reusability for new and different use cases. So if you have a similar use case, it should be possible to transfer the knowledge the model has already gained into these new use cases. So yeah, there's a quite simple kind of overview here. We have different specific data models for different applications, as well as general models, which kind of aggregate all of the data. And so when we receive new data, we retrain these, produce new specific data models, and then create the detections from this. So for the input data, this is the first step. In automated workflow, there needs to be rules to enforce data selection. So as I mentioned earlier, it could be that in some cases people might use data all the way to the edge of a UAV image, or in other places where it's not wanted. If you're, say, deriving your data set from an orthomosaic, you might be accidentally including too much data which is not actually part of the trial or on the field. And so it's important to exclude areas outside of the area of interest, for one, but also to exclude oblique angle images. You can see in the bottom corner that wheat heads in the wheat head case look very oblique at the edges, and this isn't something you want to be training your data on, since generally when you collect the data you will want to look more at the center of the image, where you can also better kind of georeference what you're looking at. And so, and then there it will cover a wide variety of angles as well, not just a single direction, which can ultimately confuse the model. For the next step, annotation is important, and there's a lot of ways that this can be done. There are kind of offline simple tools that are used, and here you might produce ad hoc data sets, but as mentioned, this can lead to issues down the line. You might have data sets which are either in an inconsistent format or created in an inconsistent way if you don't have set rules for what constitutes an object. For example, when you're tiling the images into a training set, you might have some people that label all of the objects on the edge of an image, but as you're tiling the data, you may be restitching them later and you don't want half objects to be counted. So it's better to exclude these and to exclude them throughout the whole process, which means making it so that annotators don't do this in the first place. And so we work with the RoboVision platform, which is a dedicated platform for machine learning pipelines. And here it's possible to compare different annotations between your different annotators and list teams of annotators so that you can really leverage and then build up big data sets for your data quite quickly. And of course, it outputs the annotations in a consistent format so you can use the annotations across different jobs. And it has an accessible UI. They develop a lot of features to make it easier to do annotation. And this can ultimately make it so that you already have quite nice data sets, which can be used to do a standardized workflow. For data augmentation, this is also something that we found is very useful for most phenotyping cases. If you just kind of import the data itself into a model for training, it will often work, but it might not be so generalized. And here's a case here. So what our data augmentation principally focuses on is adjustment of brightness and contrast in order to create better generalizations. You can see here that you have image number 1 on the left and image number 2 in the center. These are quite similar, but the one on the left is darker. And so whilst it won't be a huge problem, it might be that when the model does inference, it might think that certain edge cases, so an object facing in this direction is only actually an object if it's at this darkness. However, it could also, of course, be an object in the other image, which is brighter. We can see that, but to get it to realize it, you need to then have it so that throughout the training process, you automatically adjust this kind of brightness so that you can have that object count in its original state as a kind of darker image, but it also could be a lighter image or an even darker image, and we would accept those within the model. And in this way, once you have new data sets, which might be collected under, say, a cloudy day or just when it's less light, you will still be able to use the model quite well. And there are other features we work on which can be quite specific to the phenotyping object detection use case. One such feature is pseudo labeling. So this kind of is something we do because especially if you look at things like wheathead detection, it can be very difficult to annotate these images. As I've said, the annotation process is still a manual process, so it involves humans labeling all of these images. And it's just a fact that if you're labeling, in this case, there's around 97 wheatheads in this image, you're probably going to miss a few, which might just be a bit harder to see, facing in an oblique direction. And this can ultimately add error and confusion to your model. As it's training, the model will see what should be a wheathead, but it will recognize it as being background. So if you have similar cases, you might end up with a low confidence prediction of that object, or the object is just incorrectly not predicted, which isn't what you want. And so one way that you can kind of overcome that is by trying to, once you've labeled the images, improving it by filling in these obvious predictions. And so that's where pseudo labeling kind of functionality looks at. So here it takes place with the base human-made manual annotations and then trains weak models for only a few iterations. From these weak models, it takes the most confident predictions, so it still won't include just any kind of leaf or anything. And then these are appended to the training set, and this process is iterated over several times until you eventually get a point where it's either not appending more data to the training set or the quality of the new annotations is no longer good. And we found that this is something that is quite useful in organ detection cases especially. So by testing on the Global Wheat Challenge of 2021, it was able to, for our first submissions, improve the result by 2.5%, which is already quite good since there was no other augmentation aside from doing this kind of built-in pseudo labeling process. And so that's how kind of we end up formulating the model. After we've created data augmentation and pseudo labeling if necessary, we train it using our architectures, which can be kind of updated as new architectures become available, since the workflow uses an implementation interface and is made to be kind of versatile to new improvements, and the data that we use can also be kind of pushed through to these new improvements. And following that, we have the inference step. So the inference is automated for both training jobs. By default, if you train, you will likely want to do inference on it afterwards, or for additional jobs if you already have a good model. And it processes input images to be equivalent format to training data for the model. It does things like the restitching of tiles, since generally the images that you input either from a drone or an orthomosaic are going to be far too big for GPUs to handle in these kind of models. And in that process, of course, does non-max suppression to remove overlapping objects. And finally, it can publish. And so this process ends up being much quicker than if you manually went through even just applying an already existing model, or if you trained a new model from scratch. This is also sped up. And so in terms of results, we've looked at a lot of different ways that you can kind of apply these models using either the augmentations I've mentioned before, as well as the pseudo labeling we've mentioned before, and how they perform when looking at different sites and sites that haven't been exposed to the data. So in this first slide, I'm going to talk about the results for the emergence counting. And for emergence, models are generally quite good at this task. This is because to a neural network, their objects are going to be well defined compared to the background and show a very high kind of activation, which will then result in the objects being correctly classified. There are still some issues which can be due to human error in the training set. In the case of maze detection, as you see below, these images can be quite overlapping. And while the model actually handles this very well, it could be that when you have very overlapping images, which you might see in the top right corner, or very overlapping plants rather, a human might have difficulty identifying the leaves themselves. And for pseudo labeling, this, in the case of potato, actually helped fill in some of the gaps of a data set, which I will show you in the next slide. And so here you can see it. There are two instances in this image, so on the left here, as well as on the right up here, where there's two overlapping plants, where the pseudo labeling has improved the result. And this could be in the first case, the plant actually looks quite dark, so it might be that the human annotator thought this was just a patch of ground, and is also quite small, which can also be something that just isn't seen by a human labeler. Whilst in the second case, you have a plant overlap, and it may be that a human annotator didn't consider these to be separate plants, but with the pseudo labeling trained weakly, it is able to kind of already distinguish kind of what a plant should basically look like, and maybe has seen other correct examples where you do have this overlap kind of accounted for, and then assign this. And then you produce a pseudo label data set which fills in these little gaps, and that can be end up with a slight improvement to results. As you saw in the slide before, it improved the average precision, 0.5 intersection over union or overlap, by about 1%. And so for organ detection, there's a lot of different applications. In onion flower detection, it can be easier. So even here, it was found that you don't really need to include any kind of super impressive data augmentation or pseudo labeling techniques, and you still already start to get good results because the objects are so well defined. They generally stick out a lot. They have a very distinctive kind of circular shape, and that makes it easy for these kind of CNN models. And just to show another feature that we have in MAPEO, obviously you maybe aren't so interested in every single object. You want to look at these objects in terms of plots. And this kind of shows how you might visualize an output shapefile which averages the count per each area, so you get kind of density metrics for the objects. As for weed head detection, here we undertook a more kind of complex test. So we used 4 different sites containing training data, and principally used site 1 and site 2 as our test data sets. And these sites were larger sites which had multiple varieties of weed heads. And we found some promising results. So you can see below for augmentations with the site excluded. At site number 2, this actually produced the best results of all. And this is probably related to the annotation at site number 2, which included missed examples, and so highlights the importance of having a strongly trained data set. And in all cases, this the model was improved over only using the site if you're using augmentations or if you're using pseudo labeling. In the case of site 1, the best results were found when you use the augmentations and also included the data from all of the sites. When not using data augmentation, it was actually better to only use the site and not use all of the data. And this is likely due to kind of the different illumination conditions. As I mentioned earlier, generalizing the model is able to also kind of have it so that one data set might almost mimic another data set. And so that is why you end up partly with these kind of much better results when using the augmentations, because it kind of artificially makes the training set so much more robust and able to generalize. And so here's just kind of some results from one of the sites. Firstly, with no augmentation, so you can see in some cases that it does see objects when you don't use augmentation. However, with augmentation, you do generally start to see a bit more. So in this case, you can see one red bounding box in the right-hand side, which was only seen using no augmentation. Whereas at the bottom of this image, you can see in an overlapping section, one which was detected with augmentation, but not detected without augmentation, and also on the left and in the very bottom left corner. But here on this image, you can see that there are still some weed heads which haven't been detected, principally in the bottom right corner. And so this is something that we want to still get. As I mentioned, this is probably due to not capturing all of the data in annotations, which is almost inevitable when you have humans annotating these things. And so what we want to do is use pseudo labeling to address that. And here's an example of pseudo labeling on that same image. In the bottom right hand corner, you can see that both pseudo labels have now identified these objects, and they've also identified a lot more objects which weren't identified before. So in this case, I used two models. Firstly, a low confidence model where the weakly trained models used to produce the pseudo labels tolerated a lower threshold of confidence when appending new objects. So rather than using 90% confidence that this is an object when doing the inference before appending to the training set, it would use a 75% confidence. And this actually ends up predicting a lot more even than the high confidence. And you can see on the left that there are what look to be actually wheat heads that are predicted only using this low confidence model. But also you can see above them there is a leaf which was predicted using this low confidence model, but not with the high confidence model. And in the case of the high confidence model, the extra predictions all do look to be actual wheat heads, even though it still does slightly underestimate the end result. And what we're trying to address is principally underestimation, since as you're missing, principally this derives from missing data in the training set that results in underestimation, and so this is what the pseudo labeling is trying to solve. And so it's a kind of fine balance that we're looking for. And so that's kind of a summary of how it worked with the wheat head detection. Using common data collection as well as data augmentation, we were able to make the data sets more relatable between the sites and improve the accuracy quite a lot. Pseudo labeling is able to capture missing objects. However, it does need to be refined. So you can't get too greedy with it, really. If you try to capture everything, you'll probably capture too much. You'll start capturing leaves in the background or other things, where if you use it constrained, train pseudo label over several iterations, you will capture missing objects, and maybe not all of them, but overall improve your annotations. And yeah, of course, the best thing to improve a model is just to have well labeled data in the first place. This is why it's good to use a good annotation software, a good annotation platform, use reliable annotators, and have a system to actually check that the annotations are good in the first place. And so into the future, we will be working on lots of new features for the object detection workflow that we currently implement. One such thing is segmentation. So in all the examples I've shown you today, we have used bounding boxes. And this is kind of a example of how bounding boxes are labeled. And they generally perform well. As you've seen, in most cases they do predict the objects quite well, whether that be for plant emergence or for organ detection. And so, but they don't always predict everything, and this is also because you have a lot of background within these bounding boxes. You can see in some of these wheat heads, as they kind of extend a long way, you don't have a very tight bounding box that only includes wheat heads. You also have some leaf in the background, or some shadow in the background, or there could be not a tight fit towards the object edges, which can just also introduce a little bit of uncertainty into the model. And so the way to get around this would be to instead segment the bounding boxes, so that rather than having a bounding box, you have a very tight line around the edges of the image. And typically this hasn't been implemented so much just because it's always been much harder to do. It has involved, like, rather than just dragging a bounding box around the image, drawing over an image. However, smart annotation tools, so using kind of more advanced algorithms in kind of this original kind of like shape detection, is making it more possible. This is an implementation on RoboVision, the platform we use, which shows how segmentation now is becoming a lot easier. Here you can make a very tight segmentation around an object in roughly the same time it took to previously make a bounding box. And so in the future, this is certainly something that we'll be working more with, and we expect it to even further kind of improve the usefulness of object detection in a phenotyping context. Outside of phenotyping, looking at plant traits, there's a lot of other things that object detection can be useful for within the same context. It can detect other features in the field. For example, GCP detection. This is something that within automated processing workflows like our own remains a manual step, and so that also presents ultimately a roadblock between the speed with which a flight is collected, uploaded, and the time it takes to process. But this is also something that could really be automated using this same object detection workflow, and is something we're currently working on implementing so that in the future the processing, once it's uploaded to our servers, can be done basically end-to-end with no manual input, either for the initial processing, the image alignment, or for the object detection, which will result in very quick results which can be used by researchers. So to conclude, VITO works with researchers to provide technical tools and infrastructure. We're always open to new partnerships. As mentioned, we work actively on kind of creating new data sets for drone imagery, and also on looking at what new features we can implement, both related to phenotyping in general and the object detection case. UAV object detection is facilitated by more accessible technology and advances in machine learning theory. So this includes both cameras and the kind of new high resolution cameras which make it possible to actually get these very fine detailed pictures. And also for machine learning theory, the architectures are always advancing and they're becoming more and more useful for the cases that we look at. So object detection of very small and dense objects. And this also extends to things like the annotation, being able to more easily do segmentation and other kind of useful tools on that end. Object detection is difficult to scale for phenotyping applications when completed on an ad hoc basis. So if you only do it for one site and you don't consider how it might be used in the future, how you should collect the data, how you should process the data, how you should even model the data, then it will be difficult to apply models across your different sites or different applications. And so a standardized workflow allows for easier generation of applicable insights and further refinement towards a target domain. It ultimately will produce better results than an ad hoc basis. If you leverage data from different sites, not only will you be able to classify across many different sites, but also for the original sites, it will probably improve on the results that you originally had with these. And so that's a conclusion. I hope that you've enjoyed this presentation. If you do have any questions, you can contact me, sam.oswald@vito.b, or of course ask them in the upcoming Q&A session. And also, of course, a big thank you from the rest of the VITO team, and specifically the team that works on MAPEO. It's not just a solo effort on my part. There's a lot of people involved. So yeah, I'm hoping to hear some interesting questions in the Q&A session, and I hope that you enjoyed this talk and it was in some way informative to you. All right, thank you. Bye.